It is 12:31, so we'll go ahead and get started. So thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on funding opportunities in defense space innovation. We're really excited to be hosting this event today. I'll go ahead and introduce to you our guest speaker, who is Matt Tompkins. He is currently the VP of our space portfolio here at the Outpost, but most notably, he was previously the co-founder of SpaceWorks, which is the U.S. Space Force's innovation unit, where he focused on the international market and helped orchestrate and lead many events that a few of you are probably familiar with, such as the Space Pitch Day, the Allied Space Accelerator Program, and he also authored the International Innovation MOU amongst 8 nations. On top of all of that, Matt is also a career Air Force officer and serves as a space subject matter expert for Air Force's Southern and U.S. Southern Command, negotiating a multilateral research and development agreement between 6 nations. So obviously he is an expert on this topic, has a lot of knowledge on space innovation, so we're really excited to dig deeper into this topic. And our moderator today is Joey Aurora. He is the Vice President of Growth here at the Outpost, but he's a startup founder as well, an ecosystem builder with a passion for connecting entrepreneurs to government opportunities. Previously, Joey was the Chief Scaling Officer at Platform One and a pioneer of innovation ecosystems at AFWorks and AF Ventures. So we're really excited to kick off this event, learn a little bit more about this topic. For those of you who have not been a part of our webinars before, Matt is going to break down this topic with some tips, and then we will have a section for Q&A afterwards for you to have the opportunity to speak to Matt and Joey directly. Throughout the event, you can also use the Q&A function, and we'll kind of moderate those questions as they come in. With that being said, I'll go ahead and kick it off to you, Joey and Matt.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you. Really glad to be able to facilitate a conversation here with Matt. He has some great experience with the space portfolio and working in the space domain. It was actually really fun to be on a call with him earlier today as we're like bridging the gap between the civilian and military side of space. So, with the awesome work that you're doing, Matt, would love to learn a little bit more about where do you think the defense innovation space in space is going?
Great, thank you, Joey, and thanks, Madison, for that great introduction. That it's always fun to hear like your own bio read by somebody else that makes you seem a little bit different than you perceive yourself. As you heard, I was supporting the government in space for almost 20 years. As active duty, I still am a reservist, currently stationed at Secretary of the Air Force for Acquisitions, but also in reserve and did operations. I just finished a 4-year tour doing joint operations J3 in Japan, doing exercises, being the space lead for most of that. I've now left government services, my primary job, and now work at the Outpost on the commercial side. So one of the benefits that I've seen is now being on both sides of this fence. And so what I'd like to do today is to offer a perspective from both sides, if I can, and kind of toe that line a little bit. And I'll walk you through my perspectives. I'll offer some tips, and then I'd really would like to save some time for some Q&A, because I think interacting with people and addressing the things that people want to hear about is very important to me, because without those relationships, neither side, the government or commercial, are going to move forward. So I'm a big believer in nobody does anything truly great on their own. So we'll dive right in. So some agenda, some things that are not covered. I'm not going to talk about human spaceflight. I'm not going to talk about asteroid mining, and I'm not going to talk about the lunar surface, even though those are very important and clear tangential investment opportunities for space that are going nothing but up. And that's both in the commercial and potentially civil side. But I'm not going to cover those today. But of course, I mentioned them quite pointedly because I do think that they are tangential. Happy to talk to them about that in a different webinar. What is covered? We're going to talk about Space Force Centers for Acquisition. We're going to talk about on-orbit assembly and maintenance in space, or what we call OSAM or OSAM. And then I will talk about cislunar just briefly. These are important topics that are currently driving the commercial, defense, and potentially even civil market. and they need to be seriously looked at and understood. So we're going to try to pull back the veil specifically on Space Force centers of acquisition early on and make sure that everybody is on the same page with the newest information. Okay, so within that context, these are the 5 things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how to identify certain portion of information. This is the education part. We're going to talk about who I think you should partner with, how you should engage, offer some tips on strategy. And within strategy, I'm going to offer tips on both whom I hope is the government people attending and commercial people attending. Again, that's providing both sides of that equation. And then finally, my tips on what to do next and how to execute. Okay, so let's start off with some information. First of all, the defense space market, roughly $60 billion. I think it's important to note that 60% of that market is in the United States, which while that may be in the lion's share, you can see that donut graph on the right says that 40% is non-US. Okay, and I think that is a sizable market share that the US cannot afford to walk away from and needs to address with international. But as you heard in my bio, I am a big believer in allied and international cooperation, so that's my bias. Nearly 70% of that funding for the United States goes to US Space Force and the Space Development Agency. So we'll talk about those centers of acquisition in future slides, but that should be why essentially you should be paying attention to this webinar in the defense related section or sector of space innovation. Just a quick tidbit that we found in FY23, there is yet a $5 billion increase in the president's budget for space from previous years. So it is going nothing but up. I'll briefly talk about some of the mission areas in future slides. And then I think we should address the needs and gaps and how maybe they don't necessarily align with the current state of industry. One of the things that I've done in my career is try to keep track of the industrial base for space. And I think there are notable things where commercial is going, defense may not be going. And so we continue, and I do think it is important economically to continue to push dual use technologies. There's also a realization that they may not always align. And so I just wanted to make that subtle point there, and we can talk about that more potentially in the Q&A. Okay. I also think it's important to talk about kind of lanes in the road and bias. So there are different groups that contribute to what I call centers of gravity in the defense space market. So first of all, in this webinar, we're going to be talking about defense, but there are a variety of communities of interest that help provide demand signal in the space market. So that might be civil space agencies. Joey was alluding, we talked to a lot of the program managers this morning from NASA and NOAA, which was very great. But there's also intelligence, again, separate funding lines entirely from the Department of Defense. So for intelligence community, that would be the NRO and the NGA. Academia, industry itself, and then allied. So, specifically, NATO has been doing a lot with innovation. They just launched their Diana program. There's about 5 billion euros over the course of a few years. So I think it's important to kind of understand, appreciate who is driving these demand signals and what their biases might be. Second is space missions, and these continue to change. You'll see in a future slide that I have specific new topics that Space Systems Command, again, the majority acquisition center for defense space innovation, is doing. And we keep kind of changing the terminology. And with a change in terminology means potentially a change in context. And so we constantly need to kind of understand how the Defense Department is treating these space missions, because then that will dictate how commercial industry responds. And then finally is acquisition lifecycle. So we know that there are research dollars. We know that there are development dollars. There are also potentially other dollars coming in through innovation, sustainment, particularly in sustainment, that is a constant, I should say, a continual frustration within the Space Force, that there are a lot of new developments that are coming on. These are great ideas. We want to see them. Who is going to pay for the sustainment and upkeep and maintenance of all of this new software, potentially new hardware, et cetera? Those are usually different funding lines and therefore different groups with their different biases, and that continues to be a disconnect in this particular sector. All right. So who are we talking about? Who are the major space acquisition centers? If you don't already know, these are the big 4. So you have Space Systems Command out in El Segundo, and they recently completely overhauled their organization, coming off of SMC 2.0, rebranding as SSC or Space Systems Command, and now having these mission areas. So I've put them in. These are latest as of March of 2022. And we kind of need to understand some of these terms because they are going to dictate, obviously, the proposals that a lot of people come in. So you'll notice number 5 is new, space sensing instead of remote sensing. I think it's important to kind of take a look at some of these things. We don't always get org charts emailed out to us. So we kind of need to infer and understand and remember that with an org chart changes context and changes people, right? People shift around and we make relationships with these people to sponsor new contracts and come out with demand signals of new RFIs, et cetera. Those people will change to best suit the organization, but these are the latest. Next is AFRL, Air Force Research Lab /RV, which is the Space Vehicles Directorate in Albuquerque, New Mexico. These are going to be the major players in what I would say TRL 2 through 3, 4 research projects that then need to migrate over to Space Systems Command eventually. I just wanted to point out that there are other directorates besides RV, besides space vehicles that contribute to space. RY, the Sensors Directorate in Dayton, RX, the Materials and Manufacturing Directorate, also in Dayton, Ohio, has space materials experts working. So there are, different, I was going to say stovepipes, but in Space Force, we call them cylinders of excellence. And then also I wanted to point out, again, it's going to be my concept foot stomp is how are you working with international partners? AFRL, XPPI is the international office. Now they are largely policy driven. They'll be doing agreements, but it's important if you are going to engage in allied or international or non-US work to include them. Next up is somewhat of a new player, Space Rapid Capabilities Office. These folks have actually been in Albuquerque for a while, but they have recently rebranded in the last couple of years to the Space RCO and have been putting out huge contracts. The largest one was in SATCOM just a few months ago. So formerly Operational Responsive Space, but now moving over to the RCO to do this. What they are doing is protecting and defending high value assets in space. Now, a large portion of that mission is going to be focused entirely on that, but it doesn't mean that they're going to be focused solely on that. So I will tell you that the Space RCO tends to be much more classified in nature. So it's a little bit harder to potentially break into, but they are working on that. And the current director is very open, again, specifically to allied and international participation. So it's great to see those kind of culture changes. And the Space RCO is definitely an acquisition center you should look out for in responding to. And lastly is the Space Development Agency. Again, relatively new player. They had about 150 million in startup costs in FY20, and they are going strong. They've had a number of what they call tranches coming out in the link layer, transport layer. Again, more terms and definitions that is ultimately difficult and mandatory for the commercial industry to try to figure out. But one of the things that I do like about SDA is that Dr. Junior is definitely on the lecture circuit. He is constantly doing webinars and talking with people. And so I think that there's a ton of transparency with the Space Development Agency. So we'll see how funding goes for the SDA, in the coming years, and be looking at that closely. But these are the big four that the commercial industry will be looking at to provide the lion's share of research and development dollars in space. All right. Next up, I wanted to give kind of, okay, so where do they all sit, right? So Air Force Research Lab, again, I've got on the bottom here a technology readiness level, or TRL. So Air Force Research Lab is very, very wide. Space RCO, SSC, and SDA in that middle layer, even wider. The reason that they extend out to 9 is, of course, what I alluded to earlier, which is operational sustainment and dollars and that kind of thing. And then finally, you have the space operational commands. One thing I did not address until this slide is the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, or Air Force OSR. They're going to be providing the basic research. So that's real white paper, kind of pie in the sky level stuff. But it is important to understand that the government has all levels of introducing new topics And so introducing new topics and focus areas is really the demand signal that commercial market takes. And so while they might not be talked about because Air Force OSR is probably not going to pay too much for a white paper, and they're going to be looking largely at academia, they're not limited to academia and do grants all the time. Again, non-dilutive grants, just like SBIR to commercial industry. So something kind of a new player to look out for that will then transition in theory to AFRL and on down the TRL pipeline. Okay, so what are we doing to actually engage in them? Well, just bridging from the last slide, Air Force OSR does basic research in all aspects, and I would encourage you to kind of look at potentially a new player, starting if you're considering a phase 1 feasibility study, that might be a good alternate path to kind of take a look at. The lion's share of small businesses have really grown using the SBIR and STTR pod. Specifically in space, there are both open topics and specific topics that go throughout the year, which is so great that the commercial industry can actually plan for, I know this open topic happens around this time every year. That is incredibly important, not just for preparing your team and your technology, but also preparing your investment, because most of these companies, as is required by AFRL, AFWorks, Ventures, needs to be dual use and needs to be sustained by a commercial business. So having these regular fence posts and milestones of open topic and specific topics allows these companies to really plan for and project out potential defense and government business to allow the same planning for commercial business to give you that dual use product. Something just in the last couple of years, of course, is Air Force Ventures with their new tactical funding increase and strategic funding increase called TACFI or StratFi. I personally think it's a fantastic program because it introduces private funding matching. So not only are we now able to potentially double the development investment that we're getting in the Defense Department, but it really encourages and educates and pushes companies to have that viable commercial investment business, which ultimately speaks to the health of the company. And so now, you know, a lot of companies are saying, hey, I've done a couple phase 2s, I've done a couple phase 3s. What is next? And how can I get that huge hockey stick of company value that I'll need in order to have a successful exit? I think TACFI and StratFi programs are the two biggest programs that really were an answer to that commercial call. And then lastly, just a fun, I've kind of bookended some international stuff that I've talked about, is the Foreign Comparative Test Program. This is still alive and well, looking for TRL 6 or higher. Essentially, they're buying commercial off the shelf, but it's for non-US companies. So it's a small program, but it's something that international and non-US companies can take advantage of. They can potentially bridge and say, hey, we may not necessarily need to develop something that's already developed. So if you have a high TRL technology, such as hardware or software, and you're from a non-US company, perhaps the Foreign Comparative Test Program is something right for you. So I'm trying to cover as many bases as I can on how to engage. Okay, SpaceWorks. So fun to finally get engaged with all the people that really wanted to start SpaceWorks. Yes, there were a few key people that helped start it, but there were dozens of people within the military, within the civil federal space, and within commercial industry that all flew out to Las Vegas and helped us in a workshop develop what is SpaceWorks. So definitely a collaborative effort between the government and commercial industry to create that. And one of the first topics that they've had a number of awardees is called Space Prime. Space Prime is more of an umbrella of other topics, the first of which was called Orbital Prime, so there will be multiple primes in here. Initially, there were phase 1 STTRs, again, encouraging you to go out to that academic institution, but this was on orbit service assembly and maintenance, or OSAM. Ultimately, we want to, excuse me, take a look at where these Space Prime programs are going, how they're looking into phase 2, what sort of things are they looking for. Remember, OSAM is not a current mission that the Space Force is executing operationally today. So, pardon me. this is a great demand signal that the Space Force is able and willing to go into a new mission area because they feel passionately that it will provide the in-space infrastructure necessary to do other missions. It makes it a little bit more challenging because for those companies that have already been through the SBIR or Tech by Strat5 process, you have to find an end user to nominate your STTR in this case. And of course, there is no logical end user for a mission that doesn't necessarily exist the way that Space Force is envisioning it. So I think this is a fantastic olive branch that Space Force is going after. And we need to respond accordingly and offer them real solutions that are going to work, because this is the kind of programs that are really exciting to new companies or companies that exist today that have been trying to do this for years. Okay. I wanted to give some views on pitch days. We've done in the government, when I say we, sorry for the pronoun use, was a part of the government for almost 20 years. So the first pitch day was actually in March of 2019 in New York City. Then specific to space, did a few more. We did the Air Force Space Pitch Day up in Silicon Valley later that year. And then just kind of noting that that would even happened before US Space Force was established. So again, showing a demand signal there. And then the following July, we did International Space Pitch Day with our partners in the UK. DASA stands for the Defense Andics, or the Security Accelerator. And then again, the following August, you can see it migrated from Air Force Space Pitch Day to just Space Force Pitch Day. I wanted to first say in that first bullet, yes, the major defense acquisition centers for space will and must continue to have strategically focused industry days. Space Command happened just last week, July 28th in Colorado Springs, on space domain awareness. However, they must also provide public, unclassified, or potentially, I would say, allied outreach into smaller scale innovation acquisition. We can't just say, we know exactly what we want, and we're going to do this focused industry day here and push tons of dollars at it in the hopes that it'll work. We need, as a Space Force, to complement those strategic industry days with tactical, potentially innovative industry days to help supplement those gaps between large builds. I feel very strongly about this, and we'd love to talk about it in the Q&A. Now, some viewpoints on accelerators. First of all, what is the benefit? Well, small businesses gain so much experience working with mentors. And again, these mentors could be government, they can be commercial, they can be investors, they can be developers, scientists. But that is really where you, the people leading the accelerator or potentially customers, are going to be really shaping that technology to suit their needs. So rather than rely on a contract that you let and really hoping that you get those requirements right, it's important to do an accelerator on a new topic or a challenge or whatever you want to call it, to say, here's what we are intending. Let's provide that demand signal, let's provide that shaping out to those people. Why should the government do this? Well, the funding agencies get to dictate the technology and focus areas, right? So because they get to be in the driver's seat. And I've talked to a lot of senior military leaders that are like, gosh, I'm getting a lot of influx and responses and RFIs and all this other stuff. So, how can I be a more active role to that? Startups need relevant mentors and commercial competent people to be able to run these. So it's something strongly to consider. Okay, so what are my recommendations before we have a few minutes for Q&A? Well, first and foremost, I think the Africs and Adventure weekly call is, you can't ask for much more. Hey, we're going to come on every week and answer potentially questions that you have in the Q&A. You've got to start participating in that. If you have an idea, prepare an abstract, talk about the benefits, come up with a graphic of your idea. I know that sounds simple, but you'd be surprised how many companies have an idea in their head, but have not actually written out in the areas that AFWorks and Air Force Ventures are going to review the proposals in those specific areas. And then lastly, please, help do the future job of somebody else. You're going to have to research who are the customers and the users. And I hope this webinar has provided at least a portion of the customers, and potentially maybe we can do another webinar on end users and provide some of that information. Now, what are the recommendations that I have for the government? I'll be honest with you, a lot of times I spend more time explaining and educating the government on the SBIR and TAC-FI STRAT-FI programs than I spend educating the commercial companies. So please take time to review those programs, understand them, because more often than not, if you're participating today and you work at an acquisition center, your acquisition center is paying that SBIR tax. So if you don't take advantage of this program, you're kind of effectively not using those dollars that you've already paid. Please understand the MOU signature requirements. That is a requirement for the majority of SBIRs and of course TAC-FI, STRAT-FI. So understand those requirements, because then if you want to get involved, that's the first thing we're going to ask of you. And then figure out how to leverage SpaceWorks, contact SpaceWorks to nominate new topics. I'm happy to provide my thoughts on that. So that's it, Madison and Joey. Maybe we can switch over to kind of the Q&A and see what questions we might have.
Yeah, thanks for diving into that, Matt. I really, really appreciate that. We had a couple questions come through that I wanted to dig into for you, and it was a little bit on that end user side, right? So how can folks figure out like what the priorities are, right? You went over like, hey, these are the scope of responsibilities. How do people find that overlap between the civil side of what they're working on and what the military wants?
Sure. I was just speaking with some folks that provide PNT or GPS capability day before yesterday. And remember, their mission is to provide that GPS signal and all the benefits that come with it to anybody in the world anytime. Okay. But it also means that they get paid from other civil and federal agencies or partners to help out with that. So what's happening right now is those end users, their resources in order to execute that mission might not necessarily include all the ad hoc requests that they get. Well, technology is something that can provide that. So if you're looking at your technology and you're saying, I think this can help somebody, you know, in this particular mission area, that's something that you should consider, is not just necessarily the core mission area, but potentially tangential mission areas, because they are getting those requests and they have to take it out of hide and they can't say no. No one's going to say, hey, I need GPS support. And Space Force is going to say, sorry, I'm too busy right now. They're always going to say yes. And so I think, yeah, chatting with us and reaching out, you'd be surprised what you can find and see how willing people are to talk to you. I use LinkedIn every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, any of our attendees have any questions, please feel free to jump in and ask as well. Matt, as you're digging through, say, the changes that are happening on the Space Force side, what are the biggest things you're excited about?
Oh, well, I mentioned earlier Cislunar. Cislunar is, you know, really important to look at for any space company. Okay, so NASA is going to be completely focused on Mars and Artemis, you know, help getting to Mars via the moon, et cetera. So I think the space between geo orbit and lunar orbit is going to be something specifically, as we call Cislunar. It's going to be something specifically that companies need to start to take a look at. There will and already has been funding for that. Just know that there is a separation, that when you get to lunar orbit, that is the demarcation line. So Space Force has already said they're not going to do anything on the lunar surface. So there's an opportunity for companies to kind of help bridge that gap and connect technologies, and may potentially get funding from both Space Force and NASA. So that's something that I'll be looking at very closely.
Yeah, and thanks for answering that, Matt. I think this is a super exciting time to see, hey, where does the tech development go here in this space, and you know, what opportunities can be created. I really learned a lot from that presentation, and I've been working with you and gone through this multiple times. So I really appreciate you bringing the A game today. So I wanted to say thanks for that. And then appreciate for our attendees, if you have any questions or want to reach out to us, feel free to reach out to Matt on LinkedIn. As he said, he's on it every day. As you know, he's the expert here in this space. And if you ever have any questions of what it's like to work with the Outpost, feel free to reach out to us as well. Our emails are right there. Our numbers are there as well. We put that in the chat section, and then we'll keep rocking out.
There is one question from Adrian that came in really quickly before we end this. It says, does the Outpost work with any federal agencies other than DoD? For instance, does the Outpost have any insight into DHS's space needs?
Sure, I see that. Hey, Adrian, we've connected a few times. Thanks for joining today. Appreciate it. So yes, we do support other agencies. So I can talk from the space side of the house. You heard in the presentation earlier, we've already connected with NASA and NOAA just today, but have worked with other federal agencies in the past, not just exclusive to space, also agencies like NIH and et cetera. Specific to DHS, not necessarily. I think it's important if you're looking at space capabilities, specifically to say, okay, who is the agency, administration, et cetera, who is providing the capability that may be different from the people that are actually using that technology. So the example I'll give is in wildfire management, right? So we already know that the DoD, provides wildfire detection via remote sensing. To either Department of Interior, Bureau of Land Management, so that the U.S. Forest Service can then do that, and there'll be an augmentation. So if you're talking about developing that capability, you would still potentially develop it for Space Force, and then it would be used by any number of people in the government. And that is largely relocated by what's called the Civil Applications Committee, or CAC, and that's run by the U.S. Geological Survey in that case for that example. Hope that helps, but nothing specific on DHS at this time that I can think of.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for answering that last question really quickly. Like Joey said, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to the contact information that we have on this slide, as well as I put it in the chat. We also have the link to schedule a call if you're interested in talking more about how your company can pursue some of these opportunities that Matt discussed. And I will also be sending out a follow-up email that will have these slides as well as a recording of this webinar for you to use in your GovTech journey moving forward. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Matt and Joey, for giving your time to talk today. And we look forward to seeing all of you at our next webinar event.
Thanks, everybody.